Sicilian sun usually promises a warm embrace, but on May 23, 1992, it felt like a spotlight on a kill zone. At exactly 5:57 p.m., the earth beneath the A29 motorway near Capaci didn't just tremble, it erupted. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was a surgical strike of absolute savagery, orchestrated by a man who had spent 23 years living in the shadows while casting a long, blood-stained silhouette over all of Italy. Salvatore Toto Riina, known to the underworld as the Beast, wasn't interested in the old-school diplomacy of the Mafia. He didn't want a seat at the table. He wanted to burn the table and everyone sitting at it. For over 2 decades, Riina had been a ghost, a phantom general leading the Corleonesi faction. He had climbed to the top of Cosa Nostra by turning the streets of Palermo into a slaughterhouse, systematically erasing anyone who stood in his way. But by the early 1990s, his rage had a specific target: the state itself. The Maxi trial had seen hundreds of mobsters sent behind bars, a victory led by the relentless Judge Giovanni Falcone. To Riina, this wasn't just a legal defeat, it was a declaration of war, and the Beast was more than ready to answer. The forensic evidence at Capaci told a story of terrifying precision. This wasn't a crude pipe bomb. This was 400 kilograms of military-grade TNT and Semtex, meticulously packed into drainage pipes beneath the highway. The silent witnesses left behind, fragmented remote detonators, and the chemical residue of high-velocity explosives pointed to a level of logistical sophistication that rivaled any professional army. When Falcone's white Fiat Chroma hit the kill zone, the explosion was so powerful it registered on local seismic monitors. The road literally vanished, replaced by a crater that looked like a lunar landscape. Falcone, his wife, and 3 bodyguards were annihilated. The Beast had struck his first major chord in a symphony of terror, but Riina's appetite for destruction was far from satiated. He possessed a psychological profile defined by malignant narcissism and a total lack of empathy. In his mind, the state was a weak predator that simply needed to be broken. If the death of Falcone didn't make them kneel, he would take their remaining hope. Just 57 days later, on July 19, 1992, the horror returned. This time, the setting was the Via D'Amelio in Palermo. The target was Paolo Borsellino, Falcone's close friend, and the last man standing in the way of total Mafia dominance. At 4:58 p.m., a Fiat 126, packed with 90 kilograms of Semtex H, exploded as Borsellino approached his mother's apartment. The blast was so intense, it tore limbs from those nearby and shattered windows blocks away. The scene was a hellscape of scorched metal and human remains. The autopsy findings for the victims were a grim testament to the physics of high-pressure shock waves, massive internal organ trauma, and total body fragmentation. Through these acts, Riina was sending a message written in blood and cordite: I am the law. He believed that by escalating violence to an unbearable peak, the Italian government would be forced to negotiate, to roll back the anti-mafia laws, and to let the Beast return to his throne of bones. He was a man who saw the world as a series of targets, and he had spent his life never missing. He had turned the beautiful island of Sicily into a funeral pyre, confident that he was untouchable, a god of the shadows who could never be caged. Yet, even as the smoke cleared from the ruins of Via D'Amelio, the very foundations of Riina's empire began to crack. The sheer brutality of his war had crossed a line that even his most loyal soldiers feared. Deep in the heart of Palermo, a specialized unit known as the ROS was beginning to assemble a puzzle that had been missing pieces for 23 years. The hunt was no longer about justice, it was about survival. But as the authorities closed in, the question remained: How do you catch a man who hasn't been seen since the 1970s? And what happens when the beast realizes he's finally the one being hunted? The hunt was no longer about justice, it was about survival. But as the authorities closed in, the question remained. How do you catch a man who hasn't been seen since the 1970s? And what happens when the beast realizes he's finally the one being hunted? For decades, Toto Riina was a phantom, a whisper in the sun-scorched streets of Corleone that carried the weight of a death sentence. By the early 1990s, the phantom decided to become a god. He didn't just want to evade the law, he wanted to pulverize it. His primary targets were Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, the twin pillars of the anti-mafia movement, who had dared to peel back the skin of Cosa Nostra during the historic Maxi trial. To Riina, they weren't just men. They were existential threats that needed to be erased with a violence so absolute that no one would ever dare to hold a gavel against him again. May 23rd, 1992, 5:57 p.m. The Mediterranean sun was beginning its slow descent as Giovanni Falcone's three-car motorcade sped toward Palermo. Beneath a stretch of the A29 highway near Capaci, a drainage pipe had been packed with nearly 1,000 pounds of TNT and Semtex. This wasn't a tactical strike, it was a tectonic shift. When the detonator was triggered from a nearby hilltop, the earth didn't just shake, it ruptured. The blast was so immense it registered on local earthquake monitors, carving a massive crater out of the asphalt. It turned armored vehicles into twisted scrap and incinerated Falcone, his wife, and 3 officers. The silent witnesses left behind were fragments of military-grade detonators and a landscape that resembled a scorched earth war zone. The nation was paralyzed, but Riina was only warming up. 57 days later, on July 19th, the air in Palermo was thick with the scent of jasmine and impending doom. Paolo Borsellino, Falcone's closest ally and the man who knew he was next, pulled up to his mother's apartment on Via D'Amelio. A Fiat 126, packed with a lethal cocktail of explosives, sat waiting like a crouching predator. The blast was a localized sun, shattering windows for blocks and claiming the lives of Borsellino and 5 members of his security detail. Riina believed these atrocities would force the Italian state to its knees. Instead, they shattered the centuries-old wall of silence. The pentiti, the turncoats, began to emerge from the shadows. These were men who had lived by the code of omertà, but realized that Riina's bloodlust was a fire that would eventually consume them all. They weren't just informants. They were the ghosts of Riina's past, providing the ROS unit with the psychological blueprints of a criminal empire built on corpses. The investigation shifted from the streets to the psyche. Riina's behavioral profile revealed a megalomaniac who mistook terror for total control. He was a man of rigid habit, hidden in plain sight within the very city he terrorized, protected by a wall of fear he believed was impenetrable. But on the morning of January 15th, 1993, that wall finally crumbled. At a mundane traffic light in the heart of Palermo, the ROS unit finally closed the circle. They pulled over a modest Citroën and found a short, elderly man in a cheap suit. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a grandfather on his way to a quiet lunch. But as the handcuffs clicked, the facade of the beast didn't break. It merely hardened into a mask of cold defiance. For 23 years, he had been a ghost, and now the phantom was in a cage. Yet, as the heavy steel doors of the prison swung shut, a chilling realization began to dawn on the investigators. Capturing the man was one thing, but stopping the machinery of death he had set in motion was another. Because even from behind bars, the beast still had one final devastating move left on the board. Cuffs clicked, The facade of the beast didn't break. It merely hardened into a mask of cold defiance. For 23 years, he had been a ghost, and now the phantom was in a cage. Yet, as the heavy steel doors of the prison swung shut, a chilling realization began to dawn on the investigators. Capturing the man was one thing, but stopping the machinery of death he had set in motion was another. Because even from behind bars, the beast still had one final devastating move left on the board. That move wasn't a physical escape, but a psychological scorched earth policy. Salvatore Toto Riina didn't recognize the authority of the Italian state. He viewed the courtrooms as theater, and the judges as mere extras in his own bloody epic. During his trials, he sat behind a literal iron cage, his eyes scanning the room with the predatory stillness of a great white shark. He wasn't just a prisoner. He was a monument to the omertà, the sacred, suffocating code of silence. While the pentiti, the turncoats like Tommaso Buscetta, spilled the secrets of the Cosa Nostra like wine from a shattered bottle, Riina remained an obsidian wall. He spoke in riddles and metaphors of the land, reminding everyone that while he was in chains, his roots still choked the Sicilian soil. The state responded with the 41 bis regime, a draconian form of solitary confinement designed specifically to sever the head of the serpent from its body. No phone calls, no newspapers, no contact with the outside world. He was buried alive in a high-security tomb of fluorescent light and gray concrete. But the beast's influence didn't evaporate. It fermented. In the months following his arrest, Italy was rocked by a series of bombings in Florence, Milan, and Rome. These weren't tactical hits against rival mobsters. They were acts of pure domestic terrorism. Art galleries and ancient churches targeted to force the government's hand. The forensic evidence was a grim echo of the past. High-grade military explosives, sophisticated remote triggers, and the unmistakable signature of the Corleonesi. The message was clear. If the king stays in the cage, the kingdom will burn. As the years turned into decades, the physical beast began to wither. The man who had ordered the deaths of hundreds, including the legendary Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, was reduced to a frail, trembling figure in a prison hospital bed. Forensic experts who once analyzed the chemical signatures of the TNT used at Capazzi now monitored his failing kidneys and struggling heart. Yet, even as his organs betrayed him, his mind remained a fortress of malice. Wiretaps from his final years caught him boasting about the murders, laughing at the memory of the explosions, and expressing zero remorse for the children dissolved in acid or the families torn apart by his great mafia war. He wasn't a man seeking redemption. He was a monster waiting for the dark, still convinced he had won because he had never broken. On November 17, 2017, the heart of the beast finally stopped beating in the prison wing of a hospital in Parma. He was 87 years old. He took his darkest secrets to the grave, leaving behind a legacy of widows and a nation scarred by decades of blood. The silence he maintained for 24 years in prison was his final victory. But as the dirt settled on his coffin in Corleone, investigators found a final, chilling piece of evidence in the wake of his empire, a hidden ledger of names. It wasn't a list of enemies to be killed, but a list of those who had stayed silent, proving that even in death, the beast's shadow still stretches across the halls of power, waiting for a new voice to whisper the commands of the dead. The cage is empty, but the ghost of the beast still haunts the silence of Sicily.